Welcome to the first series of our Queer As podcast, where we're yarning with queer Indigenous artists and creative practitioners about their work across the public imaginary. I'm Sandy O'Sullivan. I'm a Wiradjuri trans non-binary artist and a professor in the Centre for Critical Indigenous Studies on the Wallumattagal campus of Macquarie University on unceded Darug Noora.
And I'm Han Reardon-Smith, a settler, trans non-binary musicker, radio maker and academic. I've been working with Prof Sandy at the Centre for Critical Indigenous Studies over the past 4 years, while living on unceded Jagera, Yagara-Yugarapul and Turrbal country.
Today we're catching up with queer Wiradjuri writer, filmmaker and maker of all things, including, recently, a tiny human. It's Jazz Money. Jazz has written on resistances to the colony, on connection to country, and on queer imagining. They recently made a film that forms a love letter to our ancestors. It includes the voices, images and stories buried for far too long, unheard and unseen in the collection of the National Film and Sound Archive. The film is formed within and around the Wiradjuri concept of WINHANGANHA. Here they talk about this incredible work, their work as a writer, and their imaginings of queer Indigenous futures. First of all, I'm just wondering, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Jazz Money. I am a Wiradjuri poet and artist with a filmmaking background. I am from southern Wiradjuri country, from the Murrumbidgee River. I'm Williams mob from down that way, around Narrandera especially. But I live now on Wongal country and I'm very lucky to do so. I'm lucky to live on a place that is so cared for by so many different communities, but to especially centre Wongal sovereignty, which has cared for the lands and the skies and the waters. You know, the custodians who have cared for this place have always made me feel very welcome and at home here. I married my wife just not far away on Wongal country, and we were, got to do ceremony of this place, which was really special. And I feel very, very lucky to live here. I live here with my wife and baby. And yeah, that's an intro to me.
Yeah, it's a good intro.
I should say I use she, her and they, them pronouns. I said last time I yarned with you guys that it was in a more fuck the colony way, and then afterwards I was like, and in a gender fluid way, but more in a fuck the colony way, but kind of in the middle of those things.
I think all of the above sounds perfect. We always want a little bit of fuck the colony, but also I think there's this really interesting thing around the discussion that we have now in ways that not every community had it around pronouns that gets people thinking about the mobility of them as well. Instead of, I know when I started using they, them pronouns, and I only use them, or they're my pronouns, but I had a kind, I was really belligerent about it with, I'm still belligerent, they're still my pronouns, but I kind of understand that it takes people a journey to thinking through this. And sometimes it takes ourselves a kind of journey to go, wait, what matters in terms of this? I don't mean, do they matter? I kind of mean, what functionally are you, how does it make you feel? And I think the fuck the colony is a bit of how it makes us feel about this as well, about impositions, but also about taking back gender. We've got a right to take back in any of the ways that we're regarded. I loved the stuff that you said about Wongal community. I think that's a really powerful thing to ceremony in place as well. And I found that on Darug Noora, where I live, that, this has been a really positive journey because of Darug people, and I wasn't too sure about where I lived. I wasn't too sure about a kind of big move, but it helps to have community here and, talking about place and reminding about place as well. So, yeah. Yeah, we've had a little bit of an interesting process as we've been doing this in the discussion of what it means to be queer and Indigenous. We've discovered that, unsurprisingly, I guess the project was set up to say you start with an idea that representation matters. I don't even care that that's kind of a pithy term. It's only, again, pithy if you don't, if it's so visible that it's available everywhere and that you're really getting into the weeds of it. When it hasn't been available for people at all, it's been really problematic. And so, so some of it is just saying, actually, people exist, and there are complex ways that we live our lives, and that deserves to have visibility, or that deserves to have a kind of set of discussions around it. And so I think I went from an arc of visibility and representation matters, and that's a bit pithy, to actually it really does matter, and people care about it. And that didn't come from us. That came from people's responses saying that, across the TV survey, across the artist survey, and across the museum survey that Alana Blakers, who works with us, is doing at the moment. There was just a lot of wanting to see complexity. And of course, there was also a lot of, have we always been here? And your work really addresses that in a beautiful way, this kind of persistence of where we are and who we are. So,
which is very much informed by your writing.
That's lovely to hear, but also...
But it is, and it's lovely the way that these things intertwine, and how I think we are so necessarily in community with each other, right? And that thoughts are contagious, and the weave that we're in is never ending. And so it's about picking up each other's strands, right, and keeping going. So it's lovely to hear you talking about my work, because I feel like I'm in dialogue with your work, and on it goes.
Did you always think you were going to do this kind of work? Yeah, no. I know that's a hard one. I sound like an interviewer asking that, but I'm really interested in it. Yeah.
No, but I don't even know what I do still.
Yeah.
As a job. Same. But I think if I look back at sort of the things that I've been pursuing since, I guess, I left school, it's always been oriented in storytelling and in a kind of obsessive interest in understanding the different influences on a story. And I think that's probably why I enrolled in filmmaking when I was, 18 and went to film school. But once I got there, I realized that I was 18 and didn't really actually have all that much to say or needed to do a bunch of living first. And also I hated the industry. I started working in the film industry as a young queer Koori chick, and it sucked. It just sucked. So no, I guess there wasn't I don't feel like there's ever been a plan in the sort of work that I do, but I feel tremendously lucky to do the work that I do, and to be able to sustain a life writing poetry and making art and being in dialogue and being a member of community, because I think that's really the thing that keeps me in these industries, which can be fraught and pay poorly and be toxic and be disingenuous and be full of hypocrites and psychos. But it's also full of amazing people, and that's the thing that keeps me nourished and socially satiated. I feel like I kind of marvel about this a lot with my partner, but when I go to work, I get to see people that I love. It's a social thing as well, and I get to feel like I'm really affirmed in my identity and in the communities that I invest in. And what better sort of job is there, really? If you got to live in late stage capitalism, that's a pretty nice way of surviving. So no, I didn't intend to do this work, but I still don't know what I'll be doing, in a year's time. But it's nice to do whatever it is.
Yeah, it's that issue of sustainability is something that I guess anyone who works in the gig economy, and this is the beginning of this is where the gig economy is born from the arts, right? Probably has a sense of, and I mean, the flip side of that is that I see your work goes back into film. at a very particular point. I mean, for me, yeah, like for you, it probably was always there. But, for me, I see then the work that, that you've done with the Film and Sound Archives. And, and I think about this work, which is really powerful in shaping something that has been captured and has been thought of. Can you speak a little bit more about that, maybe?
Yeah. So that film, WINHANGANHA, was commissioned by the National Film and Sound Archive, and they were looking for someone to... It was the first time they'd asked an artist to come into the collection and work directly with the collection, and they did an EOI calling out this opportunity, and I saw that, and the thing that I thought was like, I have no idea what's in the archive. And the proposal that I put forward was essentially, I don't know what you have, and I suspect it's bad. And I'm really interested in how this thing that feels almost secretive is actually still having a material impact on our lives and on our bodies. And to their credit, it was a pretty sassy app. To their credit, they said yes, and I worked with them for a number of years, going through the digitized collection that pertained explicitly to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it was really harrowing. It was a really awful experience in a lot of ways, because the overwhelming majority of that collection shows Indigenous bodies as sites of violence. And also these collections are so deeply entwined with the myth-making endeavour of white colonial Australia in many different forms, from like the most extreme sort of versions of terra nullius into these sort of like just constant stereotypical derogatory imagery that's reinforced time and time again. So this is what I was like overwhelmingly dealing with. And quite a few times I really wanted to give up, because also I was making it in the midst of like the pandemic, and I was just spending like full days at my computer watching archives and just kind of crying and being like, this is too hard. Like, I don't think I have the ability to do this. But then I kept coming back to the fact that not a given that I was given access to that space. This is a really hard one and hard fought battle to be given access. And, I am the recipient of people who have come above me, who have really fought to have these spaces made even marginally more accessible. And I felt that I had, knowingly in some ways entered into that situation, and that I had a right to see it out, because I'd been given access to a thing, and it was my job to like get in there, raid the joint and get out and sort of redistribute and redisseminate a lot of the things that I was given access to. And I also was having this experience daily of actually watching footage of elders and ancestors and kin who had the like strength or tenacity to have these stories recorded. And I was just getting this huge education in and amongst all this horrible footage. I was seeing activists and elders and leaders who were speaking truth to power and going up in front of cameras and going up in front of hostile institutions and speaking their truth. And I was like, well, if they can do that, like I can sit at my laptop and make this film and honor this legacy. And including, actually understanding that these bodies that were often depicted in a derogatory way for like cinema and film and television were not bodies, but are people, and rich, full people that are sovereign bodies that have a whole life of experience. And this like moment in front of a camera where they're being shown as like a puppet for colony is no indication of the sovereign body that's actually at the center of that image. And to speak to the honor of that person and the dignity of that person, and say like, you shouldn't be held in this box in an archive, but should be celebrated as a full person, that was also part of this sort of impetus. And I guess it all came about, like you said before, because I have this filmmaking background and I have a real interest in the way that myths are constructed in a white colonial understanding of, well, not white colonial, a white colonial endeavor to justify occupation and displacement and genocide. And I think the film and television industry has been a part of that. And so protest has to take place in every frontier where we've been victim to violence. We need to protest within that same space. And I see that in my peers in literature, with yourselves in academia, in, film and television, in all our creative arts, and in also all of our public infrastructures, right? Like, we need to have these protests happening from law to medicine to everything in between. And so when I'm going to ultimately fell into that, it's a protest, and it is also a celebration, because the point of the film, really, even though it is addressing all these violences, is to actually celebrate our bodies and our love and our joy and our cheekiness and our sexiness, and show all these things that are so often denied from us in our audiovisual media. Because we're so often depicted as sites of violence, to actually make something that shows bodies dancing and singing and laughing and hugging and experiencing joy and fullness, to make a film that celebrated that, and to show that, like, our survival and our glory is all the more powerful because of this attempt to erase us, and because of this attempt to throw violence on our bodies. And we actually become most free when we don't even let the colony touch us. And we do that when we're laughing, and we do that when we're singing, and we do that when we're in community. And that was kind of the real protest of the film, was actually to center love.
Amazing. And it's powerful in doing that. It's funny, one of the glorious, thank you. That's one of the funny things about working with archives, is that there is always an intermediary. And one of the postdocs on our program is Rose Barracliff, who has done a whole lot of work on the archive and the kind of interactions between a community and an archive held for a long time that's had kind of material interventions. So whether it's how it's collected in the first place, how it's kind of prioritized in terms of storage, how it certainly how it's named and framed, how it's tagged, how it's understood by others, and the others in all of the cases, the kind of narrowed lens of the archive, and so it's structurally colonial exclusions. It's structurally a container that is a colonial container, and I'm really interested in that in relation to probably gender in particular, but sexuality as well, but broadly, because I don't tend to make the distinction queerness, but the ways that gender kind of deviates from the way the archive can imagine is really intriguing. And time and again, for the work that I've been doing, what I'm seeing is that it's a leap to assume anything that's not found in that framing material, but at the same time, they've made their own leaps to kind of get to how they're describing people and how they're describing interactions and how they're describing relationships. And kinship in particular tends to have been reduced in a lot of instances. And I'm thinking about deeply historical stuff, and I'm thinking about more recent stuff. But in the context of, of film and sound, I'm particularly thinking about the moment at which it starts to get rethought of. And I think about the work that Romaine Morton did to kind of rethink the Sound and Film Archives work and rethink some of the films by casting a whole nother lens on films where Film and Sound Archives had someone go through and kind of do a summary, and then Romaine's gone back through and gone, maybe not. Maybe you need to think about this, or maybe you need to think about that. Did that occur to you through this process? Did you, I guess I'm asking, did you think about queerness in relationship to it? Not an overstate, like we're not there to kind of root out the queerness that they couldn't find, because what is that anyway? You know, like what do you get if you see a body like mine? Do you go, oh, gender is, you know, like you're not going to get that. What it's going to be is absent of whatever that is, because that's how that works. But I'm wondering if there were moments where, I don't know, lamented or worried it or thought about it, or
I think my experience of going through the archive, and this very particular archive, an audiovisual one, was really, it's going back to the unreliable witness, right? And we do this again and again as First Nations people, that we have to return to their evidence to justify and prove things that we know to be true, but we can't find ourselves in their archive because they wrote the archive in the image of the world they wanted to see. And so the thing that I kept confronting and continually confront is, you know, going to these spaces, wanting to find ourselves and finding their version of ourselves, and then having to backfill with the knowledge of who we actually are. And say, well, like the reality of my life lets me know that there is sexiness and cheekiness and joy and love and beauty and queerness here in these paths that we look to. And even if I can't find it in the record, that's my job now as the artist or as the individual or as a community member, as a descendant of these stories, to actually reintroduce that, or reposition it or reframe it or query it and trouble it. You know, I don't really believe that there's a possibility of rehabilitating these spaces, and I don't think it's a worthy endeavor. But I think we can point to the material impact that they have and articulate it, and with that articulating, move forward into a richer understanding of what we're going to do with these legacy of archives and with these objects, and the way that we actually frame what they mean, because we know that they're not true. And we know that they are biased and non-objective. And so, like, the job is now to point to that and say, what do we imagine into the space that's been missing, which is, I guess, what I was trying to do in terms of a gender specific lens or sexuality specific lens. There was such a mess going on there anyway that I didn't really make those distinctions so much.
No, and I think disarticulating that is actually its own problem. You know, like I think even as I was asking the question, I thought, that's not it. You know, it's just not. You know, the colonial project of gender isn't going, and there were trans people too. You know, like it's not doing that. So
there's a palpable absence of these queer stories, and even really recent stuff, right? Like I was trying to find footage of Michael Cole in the Mardi Gras parade in that kit. Like that, there is record of that, but in the official National Archive collection, no, there isn't. And just being able to like point to these things and say, like, well, you guys are being really slack even with really recent history, right? So like it's actually your job over at the archive to like assess what you're doing, and my job to kind of point out some of those problems. But like, I'm not going to fix it for you guys. I'm not on the fucking salary. Like, you guys do it.
And this is such a problem as well with the kind of containers, because there is some of that footage at the Queer Archive, but it's like this separating out that doesn't belong in the National Film and Sound Archive, that belongs in the Queer Archive. But yeah, which is, you know...
and it's interesting because, of course, one of the lead people at the Queer Archive works at the Film and Sound Archive. And, you know, and I think that's helped in terms of that. But it's a lot of work to put on a system. I don't mean the people, I mean a system that doesn't want it as well. You know, it's like there is this fear of locating something that can't be named, which I find really interesting. I always think back to the Currency Press performing the Unnameable work that was kind of a response to the fact that there was all of this play-based forms that didn't conform sufficiently to warrant, an outing of their own, so that they weren't published as whole books because they weren't really understood in that way. And I think this is, this idea of, completeness in that is a really, as though an archive is ever complete, as though archives need to have what Dr. Morton did. It needs to have this kind of, let's update this, and it needs to have the work that Dr. Barraclough is doing, which is let's stop trusting the archive. And it needs to have the work that you're doing that transforms material that is available, but not. This is the thing, is that it's not, not anyone can just go. People can if they're made available, but it's time, it's effort, and it's making those connections. And that's one of the really powerful things about the curatorial practice involved with making these kinds of spaces, But I was really intrigued then about, I'd had this experience myself of trying to find some of the material about me in the 80s, performance work and so on. A lot of it's not available. There's some stuff in Qtopia. There's a few things such as this. Sorry, I have to make a negative about Qtopia, fuck it. But it's, there's some things that are available in various different areas, but you don't keep an archive of your own life. Even as an artist, there are times that I did it, but times that I didn't. And and some of those times were like years, so because that's how it works. And so I worry that things fall away when that happens. And when we think about the very recent stuff where secondary documentation is possible, I wonder too, what we've started to see since the 80s is that we have the camera, or we have the lens on things. What we didn't have before that is a lot of that. There wasn't none either. People were making choices themselves, but and sometimes they were involved in making as well. But was that valued? And I guess these questions that we're asking, I'm kind of intrigued that institutions don't ask the same things. Don't kind of ponder at gaps, and that they're pondering at gaps there's a lot of fear around it, because I know in relation to queerness, a lot of institutions will say, well, we can't talk about that because we can't prove it, as though queerness is terrible and needs to be proven in order for it. It's almost like talking about, whether somebody has an illness. And so, that idea that you're diagnosing a person as opposed to just proposing opening possibilities. But at the same time, we actually don't want the colonial archive to frame any, like, I don't want them to over describe. And one of the interesting things about these response works, and and this work is much more than a response, and the work that Dr. Morton did is much more than a response too. It's a remaking of thinking not only about our lives and our ancestors, but also thinking about what these archives are, how they're interfering with that and intervening, and also still, as you say, not necessarily seeing a proactive job. It's almost like they realized they fucked up and then just didn't want to fuck up more, instead of actually engaging in the space, which is one of the powerful things about having someone like you go into the space and look at this material, because part of what that does is it allows the work that's found in there, the pieces, the archive itself, to come alive in a different way. And through the idea that, you're creating stories through this in the way that any kind of, linear form is going to do that for people. And those stories will carry them through into something else. And I suppose fundamentally, I realise it's a bit of word salad, but really what I'm wondering about with it is, what do you hope that someone gets out of seeing this? When I say someone with any of our project, I don't really care about non-Indigenous people. I wonder what you think about for Mob.
I love your word salad. I could listen all day, so don't worry about that. when Winhangana came out, it was the most nervous I have ever been about anything because I'd taken on a lot of responsibility in working with other people's stories and people's stories from like community stories from across the continent, from communities that were way outside of my own in a lot of ways. And I was scared because I was I was working with often legacy footage. Many times when the team at NFSA were getting in touch with communities about footage of Winhangana for rights clearances, a lot of the time it was the first time that community had heard about that footage. And we spent years on the rights clearances on that project because it was more important than anything else, really, honestly. But I was still really scared. And I remember sitting in that room at the first night, and we invited like biggest mob from all over to come down. And I started hearing people laughing at the things that I thought were funny. And there's this scene towards the end of the film where it's people hugging all these, and it's especially nanas. And I looked around the room and everyone was crying. And I was like, oh, they get it. People get it. I made something that is impacting people. And since then, it's been out for almost 2 years. We've toured it. Internationally, but more importantly, we've toured it all over the continent. And I don't go to every screening, but every screening that I have been to, afterwards, someone comes up to me and they're like, "My nan's in that film," or "That's my community," or like, "That's my song," or like this sense of ownership that it actually doesn't have anything to do with me and that it has everything to do with the people who it has everything to do with mob. It has everything to do with everyone from across the continent and the way that blackfellas locate themselves in relationship with one another. It happens in this film. Everyone finds their connection to place. And I think in my experience, that has been really affirming for people, really affirming for our communities, like who often, I know, feel written out of the story, right? And I think the most like the best bit of feedback that I've had, and it's happened a few times now, but the first time it happened was after a screening in Canberra. Mum came up to me and she said, like, "I've never known how to tell my kids about what happened here." I'm getting emotional thinking about it. And this film is a way to talk about colonization because it shows what happened, but then it shows that we're still here and that we're still glorious. And like that, as a review, I was like, oh, I did something, you know? And if that's what I can offer with this film, like a project that talks about our histories, that we're always talking about it as blackfellas. We're operating in deep time constantly, but to create something that feels meaningful and not traumatic, that's like more than I actually could have hoped for, you know, to make something that has maybe an impact on younger folk who see it for understanding who we are, but also on older folk for feeling seen and whole on screen, which has been a place that has been very fraught for our communities for a very long time. That's what I hope. Like that's the best outcome for me for that film.
I see there's a bit of a thread across that film and some of your other work that I think I read as like articulated in your poetry throughout How to Make a Basket, but in particular that poem in space making and kind of holding, not in the containing way or property borderlines and the annexing of space or like claiming of space, but instead a holding of space of really tenderly making something with care that can hold something precious and vulnerable, but also full of joy. And I'm also thinking of your installation artwork, Our Laughter Will Become the Waterfall, that was a couple of years ago at the Immigration Museum in Naarm, as part of the exhibition on joy that filled a space with the sounds of laughter and singing and water running, that also like transformed what is part of a colonial space, like these sorts of institutions and these buildings. I see that as a bit of a thread that's running throughout it, and a way of that artwork kind of giving to community is sort of making something that can stay in the space of celebration and joy, even taken from archival materials that are so full of a lot of harm and stories that harm. Yeah, so really weaving care out of that. So yeah, that's a bit of an uncollected group of thoughts, but I wonder how that translates across the different kinds of art making practices that you engage with.
Yeah, it's a lovely thing to be working across a variety of mediums, because I can see the way that the different thinking I'm having in one project informs other things, right? And Winhangana is a good example because it was such a long project. And everything that I've made since then is in dialogue with that work and is informed by the process of making that work. I think it was around the time of making Winhangana. I mean, Winhangana, in a lot of ways, it could almost be a silent film. What I was interested in was in the body. But then once I started thinking about it, I was like, well, the body isn't a silent thing, right? A body has to talk and has to laugh and has to sing and has to do all these other things. That is so where I'm going with this is, I think that a terrible violence happened in the Western academic archive, or in the Western academic practice, when philosophers, white, cis, able-bodied, rich men decided that intellectualism was the peak of any sort of hierarchical pyramid that intelligence could fall under, and necessarily put themselves at the top of that pyramid. And every other person who lives in their body, which is laboring bodies, which is birthing bodies, which is bodies that feel pain in ways that are distinct from what an able-bodied person feels, bodies of color that are expected to work in ways that white bodies are not expected to work. All these people then fall into position underneath that man who's put himself at the top about, however many 100 years ago. And I know that for Black fellas, we don't exist in the world like that at all. Our body is a part of country, which is a part of time, which is a part of story that needs to continue, which is song, which is ceremony, which is located in place, but that place is also something that we carry in our bodies. And I think about this in the context of someone who writes poetry. And poetry is this form that is seen often by a lot of people as an elitist form that is for those people at the top of the pyramid, right? And that's the way that it's taught. At least it was taught to me in school. It was we studied white dead guys, and that was who it felt like the medium was for. And I'm kind of writing into this legacy with all the caveat. Well, I'll get to the caveats, but I'm writing into this legacy that is, framed with elitism. And there is elitism in owning books, right? Or having access to this sort of literature, having the sort of education that, gives you access to some of these words, but also the financial privileges of either buying books or going into a library and accessing all these things and feeling welcome in those spaces as well, right? Which I experience as someone who looks like me, which is really different to how a lot of other people will experience these spaces. And so that's like one of the containers that's put over poetry. And I think that's been challenged a lot. In the context of this place, Black writers have shaken everything about this industry and are the best writers, I think, of poetry, alongside migrant communities and communities of people of colour who I think gravitate towards poetry because poetry is a medium that is really good with complexity, and it's really good with contradiction, because you can put something on the page and the page will hold it, and you don't need to seek answers in the way that a lot of other mediums demand you to seek answers. Poetry will hold these things really well. You can put complementary or contradictory or contrasting images with each other, and the reader will understand what you're doing with that, and there's simplicity, but there's deep complexity in that form. And I think that's why queer folk are really gravitated towards writing poetry as well, because it is this, again, this container that holds a lot. And so what I see my project as being, as someone who writes poetry, who's writing into this white legacy, but also an inheritor and a descendant of this Black and queer legacies of writing, which are very, very powerful and abundant. And I'm, a very grateful recipient of this hard work, is to think about how the body comes back into this story, right? Because I think for us, for Blackfellas, we know that poetry is not a thing on a page. It's a thing in our mouths. It's a thing in our throats. It's a thing in our bodies. It's a thing that needs our body to participate for it to become alive. That's how story and song and community has always functioned on this continent. We don't tell something, we don't read something, we don't write it down. We tell something, and we don't just tell it in isolation. We tell it with movement, with story, with intention, and with place. And so the work that I'm making, I'm really lucky that I get to publish poetry and books, but I'm really interested in how it can come off the page and how it can invite the body into that conversation, how you can make something that invites the body to circle a work or hear a work or move below or above or through something. And that happens in film as well, right? Like, how can we celebrate all these different sensorial modes while understanding that poetry is a part of that? And I think poetry is this really human endeavor. And that's kind of what I'm really interested in what I'm making.
It's
long yarn, but
yeah, brilliant. It's really funny because I was very transformed by your writing in a really interesting way. A couple of years ago, I was talking about it, thinking about it, trying to work through this issue of containers and the colonial project of gender and everything else, and I was really concerned, I suppose, that I was kind of an agent of those containers, and I was over-invested in them. That's why I was doing this work, So, and what was really interesting when I was reading your work was how much that containment that I felt like I had to have resistance to it in reading the work, because your work busted a lot of those ideas. And then I started to think, oh, bloody hell, am I actually doing this work on me? Am I rehabilitating myself to understanding this? And I mean, Han, who's had to work with me for years, knows that this is how this has often worked, but just hearing you speak again around, I mean, I've been a bit transformed again, not to flip it back to the other and not to set it up as a binary, but as this kind of continuation of thinking that the body is allowed complexity, that the body is allowed that unless it's not, and so the idea that, that bodies need to be contained, not just for the sake of it, but for the possibility of it and for the kind of comfort of others, and that has been such a disservice to our communities. And it's been a disservice to who we are as a people, to not allow that as well. And so when I think about the writing and the idea of the liberation found, I mean, liberation is kind of tricky because the way that even queer liberation has been deployed has been very much within a kind of Western structured framework of a binary of no liberation or all liberation, so it has its own problems associated with it that just need to be unpacked, not dismissed, like all of these things are not about them not working at all. It's just that we have a right to frame what it means for us rather than trying to, again, use that lens of the old white, philosophers that of course were always men who have still, been this kind of touch point for understanding complexity of information. Information is the worry, and I guess I think of information as this really broad idea, that is that can be found in whatever means we want to disseminate it, and share it with one another as well. Disseminate actually sounds like what they're doing, so I'll go back to share. And sharing is about response as well, and so I'm reminded that people feel strong things when they engage with your work. We know that, we've got evidence of that. And also I have like self-evidence that it transformed some of the ways that I was thinking about. I think that's the power in, I think one of the readings of poetry is that the power in that is it's getting people to think internally about how they feel about something. But I still think that's a little bit colonial. It's kind of like this, like, your work only matters because of how I feel about it. I hope that's okay. No, it's not. It's not. It matters because of what you think about it. It matters because there's these other moments that come out that are really powerful, not because they're reduced into something in the body of me or in the mind of me or in the, or whoever. They're important because they expand possibilities that individuals can't have by themselves as well. And, I often think about Global Indigenous Futures, the centre that I belong to. Again, this idea of futures is something that we can do that non-Indigenous people can't do. And I don't just mean it as a kind of side of exclusion. I mean, we're in charge of futures, but also we're not. Like we're imagining them, but also some of it is unimaginable, and that's okay. So the whole idea of we're going to track the futures and then we're going to arrive at it and we'll have done this by this moment is often how our centre, and even the idea of
a linear like colonial conception of time.
Indeed, it's that to begin with, but it's also this idea of goals, goals that are achieved. And as long as we can achieve this by this, and the archive is a really good example of that. And poetry in a lot of instances is a kind of busting out of that, of those possibilities. And yes, it also rewrites those ideas of time as well. I'm really grateful for being able to hear a real complexity around the shape of how it's shared, how whatever world is shared by you in your practice. I'm sort of, I've been transformed by a few people who have done this work in ways that has really forced me to confront myself with some of this. And I think about Alison Whittaker's work, who, Alison has a lot of the work aims to transform ways of people understanding. And I'm not sure if Alison thinks that, but the work itself feels like it's this anchor for transformation and an assertion as well. And there's a lot of power in people doing the work in that very particular way. And I'm kind of reminded of it because I did sound text a really long time ago and felt very like I didn't have a lot of agency in doing that. Like I feel like there is much more possibility now, but I don't think that's some sort of a luck of the now. I think it's been arrived there by the work that people, including yourself, have done to allow a space in which people can imagine more for us and our people can imagine more for us. I can't imagine anything more powerful I'm going to use, again, the kind of twee, young, queer, Indigenous kid and to kind of know that there is a broader life that's possible, but also not in some kind of if you do this will happen way, so not in some sort of a memoir-driven kind of discussion, which obviously has its own problems. But I guess in light of that, I know I'm about to ask something that sounds like it's counter to it all, but I wonder what you think about the future. And I think I just mean like your future is tomorrow or like in an hour's time or, in a year's time or and maybe this is something that you've thought about more, not to cast it, but, with having the baby, that we start to think about. I know I go through stages where I think about generations with kids and grandkids, I think about what that means, and I think about and some of that for me has fear attached to it, but some of it has like the promise. And I just wondered in terms of your work, but just, you don't have to speak to your work with it, but I just, wondered.
I think about the future a lot, but I think about it especially with a sense of responsibility. And I mean that in the most positive way. I think having responsibility is a privilege. And I think having responsibility to place and people means that you have done something right because you are responsible to others. And that is, I think, how home is made. That's how I feel that home is made, by having responsibility to a place and to the people there. And I think about the future with a deep time lens of understanding that for Blackfellas, we've been here since the first sunrise, and we have a responsibility to the last sunset, and we have a responsibility to the first sunrise. And we're in this long, long line. Not line. We're in this infinite spiral of time and place in which we're all interconnected. And the audacity to have gotten our mob this far, everything our ancestors have done, like the responsibility to continue that and take it forward is the privilege, right? And I think having a baby, of course, has made me think a lot more about the future. And it's made me realize that I am far more optimistic than I let on, even to myself, because having a baby is the greatest act of optimism that the world will get better. But it isn't a passive optimism, right? It has to then become this agent for change, because you have to say, what we have is not good enough. And I have a responsibility to be a part of this changing future, to make sure that it is better for the people that I'm bringing into the world, while carrying that flame from the first sunrise. And I think the future terrifies me. But I know that we need to have our voices in it. And that is for all of our communities in all the various ways that they exist. And we live in a time where I think we're seeing that we can't take for granted that hard-won battles will stay won, and we see that for queer folk, especially trans folk, for Blackfellas as well, that the erosion of our rights is just as quick and sometimes quicker than the gains that we make. And I think that sort of fear of the future, and all the other things that are at play there, right? Climate collapse. Climate collapse is one that I think is so horrifying and so destabilizing. And then I remind myself that Indigenous folk globally are the ones who are going to, we will lead us out of the climate collapse. And so then I feel a little bit good because I know the importance, the genuine, true importance of our voices, and that there is something to fight for. But then I look at what's happening in Gaza and feel that like weight of genocide every fucking day, and then I get despairing again. So, the future is a complex thing and we're living in it. That's another thing that's probably important to say. We're living in a time after apocalypse in so many ways, and yet we continue. And I think to be reminded, I try to remind myself of what country teaches us, right? And that is that country is regenerated through fire, and that there are flowers that need floods and fire to grow, and that only country lasts forever. And we are of country, and we will continue.
Oh, that's amazing. I think a really powerful statement, and one that I know as someone who's taught non-Indigenous people, but also Indigenous people who've never considered that we're living in the apocalypse now, or that we've lived through it, or that this has already happened, is actually a really difficult lesson, and it's one that a lot of people will say that they don't really understand. that everything is about the next steps, not about the kind of recognition that we've been working in this space for a really long time, and that some of the things that we've tried to do and done, been successful in doing, tried to do, have been blocked, and so on. And they're just actions. I mean, I'm literally talking about it like this is a bunch of actions that you do to, halt something. But it's bigger than that. It's recognizing that this doesn't connect up for our communities as a kind of through line of we've always got that responsibility no matter what, and we've got a responsibility to other people's communities when we're other people's country when we're living on it, and we've got a responsibility to shaping conversations so that people aren't excluded from it, and we've got a responsibility to to all of that is a part of this discussion of environment. And climate collapse will happen when there, and will continue to happen, when there is no capacity for people to kind of have a voice in that space. And it's it's really funny. It's kind of in the broader political landscape. It's does one voice really matter, or does it have to be a collective, or can it, and it's kind of, let's not try and make these distinctions about whether it needs to be this, or this. So let's just do all of it. But there is this sense too, and I think it now, I don't expect to, I'm not going to live a lot more years. And, in that time, I'm not necessarily going to see everything get solved in some weird way, but I really have just trust that there will be work that is happening, and it's not hope, it's trust in people doing that work, doing that work now, not like magically doing it into the future. It's community, and it's definitely mob just thinking about these spaces, these engagements that need to happen. And the only thing that I ever get this fear of, and it's why some of these, if you'll pardon the word, interventions of thinking about, queer Indigenous lives, of thinking about complexity of who we are, of thinking about reminding ourselves, again, I just don't care about whether other people get something out of this, but I think we've got to remind ourselves that we've got a right to be our full selves within these spaces, and that includes caring for country, and it includes not seeing something to the end, not having a resolution, not like setting a goal and achieving it. It includes the idea of this kind of continuation. I think about this with your work, because part of what I had to do was to imagine that I'm sitting there comfortably retired and maybe alive for a few more years in 10 years' time at 70, and I'm there engaging with some of your work. Maybe I'm reading it, maybe I'm looking at it. And one of the things I really love about it is I can't quite imagine what it is. And this is like, some people are kind of keen, you talked about mainstream film as an example. And while there are a lot of new things that can come out and new interactions that are possible, one of the interesting things about the survey that we ran on queer TV was, and we're looking at complex queer TV. So we're looking at racially complex characters on TV. We're looking at characters on TV. We're not looking at TV itself. We're looking at this idea of representation and what's possible within it. And so when I think about that, and I think about the responses that people had, there's sort of this trajectory to let's make it better, but there's also the stuff that's happened recently, which is, this resistance to DEI, this resistance to inclusion is the I think is the sort of, key thing there, and this equal opposite of exclusion. And so I think again about your work. And I wonder if you can imagine it. I mean, imagine the answer's no, but what would you, is there a thing that you think, of all of the things, I'd really like to do that? I'd like to try that. I'd like to think about that.
That's a good question. I am not very good at thinking that far ahead in terms of my own self. And I'm quite medium greedy. One thing that I have done and I would like to keep doing is working with choirs. I think that's something that there is something very life-giving about about singing. And I'm not a good singer. I say that as a not good singer. So maybe that sort of performance element. I also, I don't know, like probably a lot of people who write poetry, I always think that I'll write a novel. But it is like very time consuming to write a novel. You have to sit down every day, and I'm not sure if I have that in me. But I don't know. I think actually the sort of sassy response I want to give is not work. Like whatever it is, to not be like it's that tension of like living under capitalism again, right? Of like needing to make things that I can, provide for my family, but also not wanting to be driven by that. So whatever it is, having it centered in community and having it feel more life-giving than just having to make money to survive. That sounds like the good stuff. But I guess I'm lucky. I do get to do a lot of that. But whatever it is, I hope I'm still able to do it in 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, I feel pretty sure you will be. But sorry, I just have to take a moment. That really hit home a little bit, hearing that. Yeah, I think that's right. I guess one of the reasons that I ask it isn't necessarily like a shopping list of the things that you might do. What I always imagine is that a novel from you could be 2 pages or 2,000, and I think that's...
Well, that's what writing poetry feels like, right? Where I'm like, oh, haven't I done it?
Yep, it's true. But also, I think that's how storytelling works. I think storytelling can be 2 pages or it never stops. I think the repeating stuff people can feel like, and we hear feedback on this all the time from artists, that it can feel like its own treadmill. It can feel like it's the next thing and it's the next thing and it's the next thing. But all of these things really matter. Again, that's why we called this Saving Lives, was just this recall, the same way that that you did it with this remarkable film that recalls and reintegrates, whatever that means. I mean, it does. It's in this form, this linear form that you can engage with, and there's a real power in that, and a responsibility, and all of those other things. But I also think one of the reasons why a question around futures, our futures, not imagined futures, is important, is that we know that it gets derailed, and the derailing can be the thing. If the rail is the colonial project, the derailing is sometimes the thing that you want. It's the ability to kind of be able to do that, but it does rely on community holding you up through it. Community broadly. I mean, it's a publisher that kind of gives you leniency. It's to explore what needs to be explored. It's by not knowing the form that you're going to be in, not just by being late with stuff. It might be a rejection, but it's the idea that these moments matter more than just a particular delivery of something to an audience who engages with it, but it's also how that transforms people. And your work has transformed people. I think that can feel powerful, like a big responsibility.
You know what it feels like? It feels like the biggest privilege. Like it's the most incredible gift to get to make something that is received by people. And it's not something I want to take for granted, because like it really does astound me. Even hearing you say these like nice things, it's kind of like to make something that then goes out into the world and exists independently, of me, and then is able to meet people where they're at and become integrated in people's lives in whatever way, however minor that might be, is like the most astounding gift. I feel so lucky. It doesn't feel like responsibility and like a weight. It feels like a gift and a privilege to get to contribute even slightly to a conversation that happens beyond myself.
I loved the stuff you were saying about choir too. I probably had a somewhat conflicted relationship to choir myself, but I know that my late brother David was very invested. I mean, he was the president of what became Queer Choir, Queer Brisbane Choir. Sorry, I can't remember what it's called.
I can't remember the name,
but it used to be Gay and Lesbian Choir, and then they changed it to Queer, and went through a whole process under David as president, and he was president for about 8 years, I think, and did a huge amount of work with the choir to produce CDs, to do a whole lot of work that involved making sure that they knew that they were in place. Making sure that they always considered country. And I became a little bit of an informal documenter of it, just because I love a selfie, but I also love to video things. And so I was there kind of videoing a whole lot of the stuff that they hadn't. And I just went through it not very long ago and realized that I had quite a lot of material from when they were doing some really important work on thinking about what country means in that place. And in thinking about not just David's work, and David had written Bold. I don't know if you know about that book, but Bold was a book that had the stories of older queer people in it, including 7 stories of older queer Indigenous people in it. It was like 65 stories of...
When did that come out?
Came out in 2015. And it was...
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's really great. I'll get you a copy of it.
I would love that.
Yeah, it was wonderful because nobody had ever done it before. I don't mean as the first. I'm not a fan of that stuff. But what was sort of wonderful was it should have been done many, many, many times. And what you were getting was a lot of people telling their stories in this really... I loved the fact that, these were like 2 pages, 3 pages, 1 page sometimes, of people telling David the stories and then David writing them up, and in some instances they're writing them directly. But that there are these groups of people that we don't hear from very often. And one of it actually was, at the time, was older queer people. And older queer Indigenous people you definitely didn't hear from. You did in a kind of media form where questions are asked. And this was just breaking it out of the older. Well, one of the things that we were thinking with this is that we were just really concerned that when people ask questions, when they're having to put together a media package, it's by necessity kind of reduced. Maybe not by necessity, but it is. And sometimes that reduction of story can mean that you miss a lot of the internal thinking that can really transform someone listening to it. And I'm so grateful. Sorry, there's a very long-winded way of saying I'm so grateful. Choir, in a funny way, works like this. Like, choir is unruly, because there's like a lot of different bodies involved. And I think in a lot of ways, that's one of the reasons that I always had, I come out of working in bands where everything is about precision and everything is about getting it right or not. Sorry, that's a terrible way of thinking about music, but it sort of was like that, like I can pretend it wasn't, but it was. And choir felt, particularly community choir, feels unruly in that space. And of course, out of that, you also get wonders and you get joy and you get kind of all of the stuff in between, frustrations and, politics. And, all of those things are sort of a part of it. And I suppose now when I think about something like the queer choir that's out of Brisbane that doesn't have audition, compared to, sorry, I'm going to be mean, but the Sydney one that always had audition, I kind of like the idea of the one where you don't know what you're going to get every time, but sometimes you get some amazing magic, and that's not just about whether they're singing well. So, so it helped me in that colonial container stuff of going, maybe you're thinking the wrong way about the container. I've got to say that Han's work on musicking practice has really helped me break out of that as well. I think sometimes the ways...
Which has only come because of how much work I had to do to break out of it, being educated as a classical urological musician, playing flute in orchestras and things like this. So, yeah.
Yeah, and this is how it works. And I think we're seeing it with writers all the time, in this kind of busting through and busting out of. And I think sometimes you're stuck fighting the wrong fights as well. I think about, I was talking the other day about us getting funding for Gravity. Was it Gravity? Yeah. Ali Jane Smith and I got funding in 1994, I think, from NAVA, which is a visual arts association, but we were artists in residence at the time at a major gallery, and we got funding to produce sound text work in the form of a CD, and we got so much backlash from visual artists saying, how dare you take our money? And it's like, wait, I work in galleries, and we spent a lot of time arguing for the work that we did and then making the work, but too much time was spent arguing for being able to make the work, that it shapes the container of what's possible. And I think about that in terms of these disruptions of container and like who you choose to work with. Do you work with people who are maintaining a container or who are kind of disrupting it? And how much is that upheld in this process? And, and we know that, that frequently there are these resistances from across our communities where people will want to reproduce what they know, has worked, and disruptions of it can feel like they're a journey too far and that they're actually not traditional or historic or Aboriginal enough. And I guess I now know how to resist that. And when I was younger, I was like a bit about complying with the idea of that. And it's through reading work like yours. It's through, so it's not like getting older. It's getting older and getting wiser, and just realizing that people can disrupt this. And it's not just destabilizing, and you don't have to have the same old fucking conversations over and over again. You can leave those conversations behind and move into something that's meaningful. And I really hope that that's what happens with the work you make. Work, art, whatever, work is tricky. We know it's tricky. It's tricky in the way that we're describing some of this as well. The whole notion of a workplace in this space is both a privilege and something to be supported and also something to be challenged.
No, sorry, keep going.
No, I think I ran out of steam on that. I think part of what I was thinking about, again, with these ideas of, the shaped containers, is that they really only ever work when you can bust out of them, for me, and I know that to some extent that's because of how much it's contained me in relation to gender, how much it's set these sort of boundaries that are unhelpful and that have shaped my life more than I want them to shape anyone else's. And again, that's me. Like, people have their own struggles. It's not it's not for me to define what they will or won't be thinking through. But I worry a little bit that there is a reproduction of having to fight these battles, and that each generation, or even just the next year, or even just us the next year, have to fight the same battles. And I think there's a lot to be said for being able to capture them, document them, in a way that talks about the power of whatever that disruption was, and that names it. And I think when I think about the film, it does that. Yeah.
Thank you. I sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, I think that's part of what when you were talking about documentation before and like your own personal archives, I think that's really important, because I think there is like a very pervasive amnesia, especially in the queer community. And we spoke about this in the past, but I think there is a bit of an obsession with first in a way that is not honest, but it's not knowingly dishonest, right? It's just that there has been this constant erasure and this constant obfuscation and lack of documenting. And I think the lack of documenting is sometimes like kind of like badass, right? And it's kind of like,
yeah.
Like you don't need to prove the existence of something. And I also think that there is kind of this compulsion to collect the debris after ceremony, right?
Yeah.
And that's what the archive is. And I think a kind of queer rejection of that is like, and a Black rejection of that, and the rejection of like needing to hold on to the debris of the past, but to actually celebrate the present is is amazing. That's why we have like an oral history tradition, right? But I can see the way that plays out in the queer community is this really destabilizing lack of a tangible history that can be held and pointed to and uplift one another. And I think there's a bunch of like very real histories that explain why that has happened and why, you know, hiding in plain sight has been something that's been adapted and, you know, in many ways perfected by the queer communities for survival, right? But I think we are existing in a time where holding up these stories, celebrating these stories and documenting what our elders have accomplished makes it safer for folk who are confronting similar or the same or different challenges to know that it is part of a legacy and not feel like, you know, you're inventing it for the first time or like we said in the, you know, last time we met up, this kind of obsession with the first, almost as though like it's an obsession with coming out, like it's the coming out story that defines us, but not the rest, not the community. And I think it's the community actually that defines us as queer folk, right? And decentering the individual and putting it in the tapestry of everyone else, it certainly makes me feel better and safer. And I think that kind of comes back to the metaphor of choir again, right? Like choir is not about the individual voice, it's about the voice in community. And there's a great expression that I've heard Sarah Saleh, the Palestinian Lebanese poet, talk about, which is how activism should function like a choir. So when you need to take a breath, you know that everyone else is going to keep singing and that we need to hold each other up in these different ways.
I think that's really powerful. I think there was one thing that I found really interesting about, gosh, sorry, I'm really caught up in that last moment. You know, you mentioned tangible, and actually at the same time as you said the word tangible, I had been thinking about what you just said before and the fact that it is framed within intangible cultural heritage, you know, so that you have UNESCO not being led by just ideas of this, but being led by people like Terry Janke, kind of saying we need to recognise intangible cultural heritage. And actually, when you talk about choirs, it's usually seen as tangible because of secondary documentation. But the truth is that it's in the moment that you're in. It's the intangible that is often, you know, where the magic is. And so that secondary documentation in the form of, I don't know, documentary kind of, you know, we think of it in lots of different ways, but music is largely not seen as one of those intangibles, but of course it is. And of course, so much of the work that we do is, I think, of, you know, performance poetry as opposed to reading it off the page. And also the what's tangible and what's intangible is often continuing to exist in some form. And the way that there were all of these resistances and kind of gaslighting around intangible cultural heritage when it was first discussed was very much like that. It was, sorry, but actually that cosmetic manufacturer did find that plant, and yes, people have been using it for a long time, but they never documented it in this way, so they have a right to, you know, put a plant mark on it, and they have, you know, so all of this kind of dismissal of anything that came before because it doesn't have, and that continues because it doesn't have documentation, is such a, you know, and I think it leads to things like firsts so that they're marked. I think, you know, when Luke Pearson talks about like what about the second and third and fourth, I'm much more interested in them than I am in the first. That's also, you know, it's not making the same point, but it's making the point that this is about plenty, not about a lack, you know, not about an absence as well. And, you know, that all that it's doing is saying a lot, like it's the person who said that who's kind of telling on themselves, you know, and this is the first, what do you mean? You know, so I've found myself kind of having to disrupt that and anything that I've said in the last, 6 or 7 years, because I've recognized that it becomes that self-realizing thing. And people often will do it with me. I'm sure they do it with you, Han. I'm sure they do it with you about things that they see you as really centrally involved in, where they really want you to be the pinnacle of that stuff, and it's like, probably not, like, definitely not. There's no such thing as that. It's, it has to be disrupted, but people get really excited about it, including the people who are that. And especially if they haven't been praised before or recognized before, there can be a real desire to go, yes, I am the first to do this, and yes, I am the one who came up with this idea, and yes, I am the one. And I can see that across mob for really legit reasons, that they really weren't recognized in that way. And when I think about Mardi Gras, and when I think about the way that Indigenous people kind of understood in that space, and I mean Indigenous, I don't just mean Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but this whole idea of a kind of group of people who come together to celebrate world over, and then there's Indigenous groups that are also celebrating. It's seen as this sort of graft or something. So it's seen as something that needs to be kind of taken out, but exceptionalized, but be part of this whole. It can't be recentered so that Indigenous people are at the center of that. It can't work that way, and I don't even care if there's evidence or proof of this. I care that it's talked about, that it destabilizes those ideas.
And that's that idea of like what is in the center is really interesting, right? Because then it points to like what's at the periphery. And yes. I think if what we deem to be like the center is a movable feast, right? And it depends on the context and the parameters that we want to put around it, that we can identify what the center is, right? But if we want to talk about a broad sort of Australia, and we want to talk about like what is, a central Australian thing, and we do stats around like, a white Australian majority, and it's theism, straight, and whatever else, and it sounds like fucking awful. And then we look at like what is on the periphery of that, and all these groups all these people that don't fit within that center image or that center ideal. Being at the periphery means that you're pushing things forward, right? And forward in every direction. And that is so, like, who wouldn't want to be there? Like, be on the edge where the things are happening, right? Where, like, you get to taste the sweeter fruit. I think it's I thought about this a lot, actually, when Brooke Andrews did Niran, the Biennale of Sydney, because Niran is, our word for edge. And this idea of, like, it's actually from the edge that you can see things clearly. And that, forest for the trees or whatever else, but like being on the edge, being, say, a black fella or a queer person or a trans person or someone who has something that marks them out from being in the center, means that you can actually speak more clearly. And I think that's a really powerful and important thing. I like to think about it. It kind of makes me view the world with a richer sense.
And using that, you can borrow from, non-Indigenous anthros who said, you people can't even look at your own people because, you're too invested. And it's kind of, well, first of all, that's not really anyone, but also no, because, and so I think there's a tension in it as well, which is right. It's correct that there's a tension in it, because things aren't just answers and solutions. There are ongoing discussions around what that means. And, I think about the broader population in the world who doesn't understand the difference, and think about it in terms of the economy, between median and average salary, for instance. And I think people don't understand like fundamental things that are about rights that people have. These really, really basic things. How are they ever going to understand things that fall outside of those containers that are actually really easily passable? How are they? And I think the answer is to reading, the public imaginary, the work that's available across the public imaginary. I think it's reading poetry. I think it's reading the complex ways that you write, in whatever form. So this, these ideas that are not giving people answers, but are giving people ways to think, are a part of that as well. It allows folks to kind of think outside of something that they may not even really understand anyway, you know. I know that starting this project, a lot of what we talked about was what do you hope a young queer Aboriginal kid thinks of in terms of their lives and their way of being in the world. Some of it's sort of value stuff around, you know, do you feel like you can talk to everyone? Do you feel like you can talk to anyone? Do you feel like that matters to you? Do you feel like you can hear other people and how other people have experienced the world? Do you feel like there's a space to be able to do that? And I suppose we wanted to populate some ideas into that space so that people could get to hear complex stuff, actually. You know, there's a lot of, it's like academic to have complex. No, it's not. It's not. People want complex stuff all the time, you know, like they want it in a way that they can understand, but that's, you know, to not do that is its own problem, you know, but people want to be able to think hard thoughts, you know. Hard isn't bad. It's just, I don't know the answer to that, but maybe in 10 years' time, that conversation that I heard means something to me. And I know out of this, that's going to be the case.
I think just to like pick up on that thing about what, you know, so the figurative young Black queer kid, right? Something that I am constantly amazed by is, as a queer Wiradjuri person, in very recent history, we've had a fucking national vote on the rights of, a proxy vote on the rights of Indigenous people, and we've had a proxy vote on the rights of queer people, right? And those have happened really, really recently. And you could think that it is hard or bad to be Black or queer. And everything that is good in my life comes from one of those communities, you know?
Yeah, same.
Wouldn't want to be anything else. And I think that's the thing that, like, if I could like go back to, you know, myself as a young person or any young person who's like, I don't know, wondering what it means to be these things, it's just like, it's so good, babe, it's so good. Like, the water's warm, jump in. And actually, it's both of these communities are families, you know, like, and I have only ever felt like I am more and more held by family the more and more I let myself be vulnerable to those communities. That's a good thing.
And you know, I know that the way that you're talking about them is both as separate and connected. But I think for a lot of people who don't understand how those connections work, and that's maybe all of us, I mean, because, you know, it's not like you spend every minute thinking about the connections between them. I think that's been the hard part. Like, I've been involved in writing things where I talk about a kind of, you know, connection of it, and that's all very well and good. But I've also been involved in writing things where I'm almost asked to silo these things, you know. So Indigenous people are allowed into the queer space, but are centred in this other space. And I think what happens for a lot of queer mob is that they have been asked to pick one, you know, which I've written about before, the whole notion of pick one. I think understanding that we don't have answers to that is a part of it. Like, I don't think there's an answer. Like, I'm not sure if you have one, but I know that I don't. You know, that this is about saying, like, for community's not trying to find a way to have distance from its members. You know, like, our people are not trying to find a way to disconnect. Individuals, that's on individuals, but that's not, you know, what a community does. Is you know, it's not attempting that ostracizing, but it doesn't mean it hasn't historically, any community, and it doesn't mean that there's not bad acts within spaces. And it's the same in terms of queer community with mob. You know, I mean, I've had a lot of instances where there's just been sort of inherent racism and weird ways of understanding. I know one of the things that we argue against all the time is that a lot of non-Indigenous people use Indigenous people as an argument for queerness, especially for transness, you know, and I find that just appalling. And you call it out. Like, you call it out and you say, don't do that again. You know, like, this isn't a thing, stop it. And, you know, we're not your proof of concept, you know, and that's it's bad actors. Like, people aren't magic because they belong to a community of any kind. There needs to be this notion of a sort of public education around this, or just conversations, maybe is a better way to say it than public education. And, it feels like they've been isolated into these spaces in ways that are helpful if you're an organisation, wide organisation, universities, processes of reporting, whatever, any of those things. But actually in the lived experience, people are a complexity of things, and they are looking to that complexity to live their lives. So
that reminds me of something that Jen said to me years ago now. So my partner is white and like queer non-binary, and they said to me, someone had asked them, like, oh, is it hard for Jazz, being Aboriginal and gay? And Jen was like, every black fella I know is gay. Wait, what? Like, it hadn't occurred to them that this was a minority in a minority.
Yeah.
Came home and they were like, there are actually straight black fellas out there as well. And I was like, I know.
But, obviously, as you know, I worked with Jen, and that was our beginning point. And when that's a beginning point in conversations that you have, where there's this absolute understanding, it means you don't have to go through a whole process of education. You're able to set it aside and get into the nuts and bolts of things. And you do more, whatever it is, like in conversation, in work, in whatever, you're doing more when those things don't need to be rehabilitated. Those ideas don't need to be addressed. I think there's a real power in it. But what keeps happening is that for, Indigenous people internationally, for mob here, it becomes this kind of reduced thing that others impose. And sometimes we do, because they're the things that, have always happened, or that we know, or that we have funding structures for, or that we, there's these, but I think the more that we understand that they're imposed from somewhere else, the better off we are to challenge it, because we're really good at challenging things that have been imposed. So, yeah.
But I think it's got so much to do with this sort of idea that identity is like this bunch of labels that you stick on your chest or something like this, rather than it being something that exists relationally. That's about, I think that's something that I've really learned from working with you, Prof, and that it's not about like adding more categories. It's not about adding more containers. It's expanding the very idea of what it is to be in community with others, to be queer in community, to be trans in community, to have a self-definition that exists only really in relation rather than in isolation.
I think that's right. And I think there's a really interesting problem that happens with this as well. And that's, we don't, if I think about the media, like if we were doing this interview and it was going to be reduced interview, sorry, I've just turned it into a media interview that's going to be reduced to 2 minutes. If it were that, a lot of it then becomes about multiple labels or whatever. So what allows that to be cast aside is time. It's like having that time. It's interrogating those ideas, so that there's no possibility that it comes down to a listing of someone where they're just the identity that, that can be framed in that way. Like, I wake up every morning and have coffee and think I'm queer, trans, Wiradjuri person today, as though that's a thing that anyone is going to be thinking. The only time that I've ever thought that, and I have had times where I've thought that, is when it's been trying to deal with another person, trying to deal with another set of problems or activities that require that. And that's not an end goal to have that. That's not the destination that I want in my life, and that we deserve to have. We deserve there to be just an assumption that we're complex beings, and that also we can talk about our experiences. That's not to say that being queer doesn't matter. It's not to say that being Wiradjuri doesn't matter. It's not to say that who we are as people and what we value doesn't matter. It's quite the opposite. It's to say that it does, and that we can't be assumed to fit within these categories, to kind of be of service to the world. And I think for a long time I did think that. And it's great to be at this side of time and not thinking that as much. And and also definitely one of the problems with self-realization on any of that stuff is that you also realize that you have to have caution about how you think about other people, not just how you talk, but how you interact, but kind of how you make possibilities for them in spaces and how you value. I mean, I can't imagine my life without the last 2 hours. This has been incredible and transformative. And that's not surprising, even though I didn't wake up this morning thinking I was going to be really transformed. I know that I'm writing this book on Colonial Project of Gender now, and I'm really sorry, but in my mind through this, I was thinking, well, that's a quote. Because
I'm honoured.
It captures. It really speaks to what others need to understand. I mean, it's not evidence, it's not proof, it's thinking and sharing that thinking. And
it's also something about existence without performance, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Like this idea that, like, as you were saying just before, you can understand the complexity in yourself and you don't need to perform that complexity for others to, be tangible or be digestible or be palatable, right? And the moment that you allow that sort of brevity and depth and love and care for yourself, then you go like, oh, well, look at me living in a world with 7 billion people. Who am I to assume a fucking thing?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I mean, that quote's definitely going in there. That might be my favourite one, though. I think we've just been asking if there's anything else that you want to say.
Recognizing we have kept you for some time.
Yeah, I'm not sorry.
No, I mean, I really love the yarn and to get to think about things. It's that thing that I think I said last time we spoke, which is like, I do my best thinking in dialogue with people. I'm not a very good sit down and think it through person, and it's a real gift to get to have just rich yarn. Yeah, so thank you. One thing that I did think before, and I was like, I'll put that in an email, but I'll just say it now because it's easier. When I was making my list of all the bodies that have to live in all the people that need to live in their bodies that aren't the white men at the top of the pyramid, I don't know if I said queer people and trans people, but I should have if I didn't. So that is also in that capture. If for any reason you guys want to pull that out, there's my postscript.
Yeah, perfect. I think what's really interesting about that is that when there are those, so say you think about a white philosopher from the beginning of the 20th century who is given this enormous regard, and by the way, they almost never have to back up anything that they said with actual proof of anything. Like, they're terrible researchers, these people, but they're cited
the vibe. But they had a vibe.
Yeah, that's right. They believed a thing and then they said it, then other people believed it. But what's interesting is when they're queer and or trans, because I just assume everyone is until I find out that they're not. Like, everybody historically was trans, and then maybe they're cis if they can prove it to me. But in terms of the assumption, that then becomes a kind of shape of distance or difference, or it becomes a shape of ignoring. So it becomes a problem that gets attached to them as people, when it's kind of revealed afterwards, and there's a number of instances, or it becomes a foible, it becomes all of these things that are about problems associated with it, and it's the distance from a concept of normal, because as much as they want to be, none of them are friggin' normal. Like, this is not normal, to be that, and they aren't all the same, and they're not homogenous, no matter how much they imagined that they were and that others imagined that they were, even them, even. So, that's the sort of fascinating thing about it is, I'm going off to make a case about white philosophers are all really complex people, white male philosophers are really complex people, because that's not how they're regarded. Not really. And when they are, it's to give them depth not to give them problems. So they're also allowed to have, for instance, queerness as a reward, as a kind of contemporary reward. And again, this is its own problem in terms of that. But yes, absolutely understood there as a postscript.
I didn't speak at all about rivers and binaries and boundaries and borders, but you guys got that last time.
Rivers and binaries and borders are part of what people can read your work for too.
Yeah.
I mean, this is I feel
like we kind of touched on some of those areas. I thought about prompting some of that, but then I thought that we'd covered some of that thinking in other ways in a bit. So yeah.
Now I want you to say something about it. Do you have some thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I can, of course. Because I think ultimately everything that I ever think that I think is an interesting thought, I then realize country has already shown me.
Yeah.
And country always has the truth of the thing if I actually just can quiet my busy mind and let myself be a Wiradjuri person that is just a part of country. And it feels like often I have to shed the English language and the Western education system that I've grown up under and give myself over to a wholly Wiradjuri philosophical, pedagogical place. And then I see the truth, and I feel the truth. And that idea of what the rivers teach us about, being good neighbours, for one, that we have a connection to everyone upstream and down, and that we need to treat the river as our kin that connects us to everyone. The way that my elders have explained it to me is that the borders of our nations are not sites of division, but are sites of gathering and are sites of celebration and shared resource and sharing. And that's the way that I understand community. And it's also the way that I understand queerness, is that it's these blurring of it's the things that make us different that bring us closer together, right? And that we need to care for one another with abundance at our sites of difference. And that these are blurry, bountiful areas. And that's what our bodies are as well, right? Blurry, bountiful things that are in community and in reciprocity. The rivers teach us this, and our sites of responsibility and care teach us this, right? It isn't to be of country is to have responsibility in two directions, right? Country cares for us, so we must care for it. And it isn't a burden, it's a gift. But also, you don't go grabbing other people's shit because you've got enough to do. You've got enough to care for. Why? It's a lot.
Yeah, why take on more? Yeah.
Yeah. You don't go fight at a border so that you can grab someone else's stuff because you don't know the story of that place. You don't know how to care for that place. That there is enough where you are. Yeah, that's a thought.
Yeah, that's a really powerful thought. I feel like I might have to share writing credit on Colonial, which of course I will. I think that's part of this process, is expanding our ways of thinking about this. And again, I'm just going to say, just that last few minutes were as powerful as the last couple of hours in terms of adding to that. It's really funny to hear it. Some of it are things that I think too, but some of it aren't. Some of it is new info for me, or new ways of thinking about it, if you know what I mean. We're often asked to reproduce for others something that there can be a kind of yawn, everybody here knows this already. I think we've got to remember that while some people aren't the best storytellers, they're so it can be a bit like that. The truth is, it's people's journey towards that as well that they're describing. And sometimes it's shared, and sometimes it does this extra work that really helps understand not just the colonial project and what we've been excluded from, but what we are actually a part of. Yeah, amazing. Lovely. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a lovely thing. It's a good thing. Yeah,
it really is. Yeah. You've been listening to Jazz Money, Sandy O'Sullivan and Han Reardon-Smith on the Queer As podcast. Queer As is part of the Saving Lives research program that recalls and centres the power of queer Indigenous artistic thinking and creativity. This anti-colonial podcast is sponsored by the Australian Research Council and in partnership with Indigenous X and the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. To find out more about Jazz's work, please go to the Queer As website. That's queer-as.org, where you'll find links to their work and the work of other artists and Blackademics, with a Q, and Indigiqueers with a capital Queer.